My name is Adam, and for most of my adult life, I thought I understood what it meant to be responsible for someone else's well-being until one day, I woke up and realized that no matter how much you give, some people will always expect more even after you've given them everything. I grew up in a small town just outside of Richmond where my parents ran a hardware store, and my older brother, Ryan, was always the golden child who could do no wrong no matter how many wrongs he actually did behind closed doors while everyone else looked the other way. I wasn't jealous of him, not at first, because I figured we were just wired differently and that one day our paths would even out, but as the years went on it became obvious that I'd be the one cleaning up the messes he left behind, and somehow no one would notice that I'd quietly become the glue holding things together. It started out small, like bailing him out when he forgot to pay a bill or lending him money to fix his car, which somehow always broke down when he had plans with a new girl and couldn't afford to cancel. I never said no, not because I didn't want to, but because I knew that if I didn't help him, our parents would find out and they'd worry themselves sick over him and end up blaming themselves, which would only make things worse. Eventually, helping him became part of my identity, and I got used to rearranging my own plans to make sure he didn't completely fall apart, which meant I'd show up late to dates or skip vacations just to make sure he didn't get evicted or lose another job, because he overslept after staying out too late with people who didn't even care enough to call him the next day. At some point, I stopped keeping track of how many times I covered for him because it became normal, like brushing my teeth or locking the door before bed, and I thought that maybe this was just how life worked when you had a sibling who never really grew up. Then he met Emily, and for a brief moment, I thought things might actually change because she seemed grounded and kind and genuinely interested in helping him get his life together, like she saw the good in him that most people had long stopped trying to find. They met through mutual friends at a cookout, and things moved quickly between them with late-night phone calls and weekend getaways and plans for something bigger that neither of them could really define but both were convinced was the real deal. I met her about 2 months in and immediately liked her because she asked thoughtful questions and listened in a way that made you feel like your words weren't just background noise, which was rare considering most of Ryan's past girlfriends barely looked up from their phones when you spoke. Emily and I got along almost instantly, and while I never overstepped or inserted myself into their relationship, I did find myself rooting for them in a way I hadn't expected, because if anyone could bring out the best in my brother, it was probably her. For the first time in years, Ryan seemed motivated and focused, and even started waking up early to apply for jobs instead of sleeping until noon and blaming the world for his bad luck, which made me hopeful that maybe this was the beginning of a new chapter. For a while, things seemed to be going in the right direction, and I allowed myself to believe that maybe, just maybe, Ryan had finally grown into the kind of man who could be depended on and trusted with the kind of love that didn't come with conditions or countdowns, but instead offered stability without asking for a constant rescue. Emily encouraged him to go back to school part-time, and he actually signed up for evening classes at a local community college, which was something I didn't even know he was capable of committing to because historically he'd flaked on anything that took longer than a week to pay off. They moved in together a few months later into a small apartment just outside of Charlottesville, and I helped them haul boxes and build furniture and laughed with them over takeout on their first night there, thinking this was what family was supposed to feel like: supportive, close, uncomplicated. I started seeing them more often, and it became a regular thing for the three of us to grab dinner or watch a game or take spontaneous weekend drives just to get out of the house, and during those moments I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: belonging without effort. Emily and I always talked easily, and there was never anything inappropriate or overly personal between us, but I won't lie and say I didn't notice the way her eyes lingered a little longer when she laughed at something I said, or the way she always remembered the smallest things I mentioned, even in passing, like how I took my coffee or the name of my favorite childhood pet. I chalked it up to her being thoughtful and never once let my mind wander beyond what was respectful, because as much as I admired her and as rare as her kind of energy was, she was with my brother, and that boundary mattered more to me than whatever fleeting curiosity might have crossed my mind in quiet moments. But as time went on, I started to notice cracks in their relationship that reminded me too much of Ryan's old patterns: the way he'd show up late without a real excuse, the defensiveness that kicked in when she asked about his schedule, the way he brushed off her concerns with jokes that didn't land, and silence that lasted longer than it should have. She confided in me once during a walk when Ryan was stuck at work late again that she felt like she was trying harder than he was, and she didn't want to be the only one holding everything together because she'd been in that position before, and it nearly broke her. I didn't know what to say because I couldn't defend him without lying, and I didn't want to speak against my brother even though I knew she was right, and that made me feel like I was standing in the middle of a burning room holding a glass of water I wasn't allowed to throw. Things got worse after Ryan lost his job due to missing too many shifts, and instead of being honest about it, he told Emily he was taking a break to figure things out, which really meant playing video games all night and sleeping until noon while she worked double shifts to cover the rent and groceries. She reached out to me more during that time, and I tried to be there for her without stepping over any lines, but each conversation felt heavier than the last, and I started to wonder how long she'd keep trying before she finally gave up and walked away for good. Eventually, things between them hit a point where the weight of everything Ryan refused to take responsibility for started showing in the way Emily carried herself. Like she was slowly fading into the background of her own life while still trying to hold together a relationship that kept demanding more than it ever gave her in return. I saw it in her eyes when she'd come by to drop something off or call just to talk about anything except what was really bothering her, and I could feel the exhaustion in her voice when she'd say she was fine in a way that clearly meant she wasn't but didn't have the energy to explain. Then one evening she called me out of the blue asking if I could meet her at a nearby coffee shop, and there was something in her tone that made me stop what I was doing without hesitation and drive straight there wondering what kind of emotional storm I was walking into. When I arrived, she was already sitting at a corner table with her hands wrapped around a mug she hadn't touched and her eyes staring blankly through the window like she was watching the pieces of her life fall apart one silent moment at a time. She told me she'd finally had a serious talk with Ryan about everything from the job loss to the growing distance to how alone she felt even while living under the same roof, and he reacted by accusing her of being too demanding and not supportive enough, like somehow it was her fault for expecting consistency and basic communication from someone who claimed to love her. She said she was tired of fighting for something that clearly wasn't fighting back, and she didn't know what to do next because part of her still loved him, but another part was starting to resent the version of herself she had become just to keep the peace. I sat there and listened, trying to offer comfort without crossing any emotional boundaries, but the truth was I was angry not just at Ryan for repeating the same selfish patterns he always had, but at myself for not stepping in sooner or saying something when I saw it all unraveling right in front of me. That night when I got home, I found Ryan half asleep on my couch where he'd decided to crash after getting into an argument with Emily, and he asked if she'd said anything to me because he could tell she was distant, and I told him she was struggling without going into detail, hoping it might wake something up in him. Instead, he just shrugged and said she'd get over it like she always did, and I realized in that moment that he still didn't understand how close he was to losing something real and how little effort he was putting into keeping it alive. Over the next few days, things between them grew quieter and more strained until one morning I got a message from Emily saying she'd moved back in with her sister temporarily to get some space and figure out what she wanted because staying had started to feel like slowly erasing herself in exchange for someone who didn't even notice she was disappearing. Ryan acted like it was no big deal and told everyone they were just taking a break, but I knew the truth because I'd been watching the cracks spread for months, and now the foundation had finally caved in under the weight of all the unspoken disappointment. In the weeks that followed, I tried to keep some distance between myself and everything that was unraveling around Ryan and Emily because no matter how much I cared or how close I had become to both of them, I knew that this wasn't my story to fix, and stepping too far in would only make things messier than they already were. But even with that awareness, it didn't stop Emily from occasionally reaching out just to talk, and it didn't stop me from answering because truthfully, I missed her more than I was willing to admit, and I didn't know how to draw a line between what was appropriate and what just felt natural after everything we had shared in the background of her relationship with my brother. She'd text me updates sometimes about how she was applying for new jobs or that she had finally signed a lease on a new apartment closer to work, and every time I saw her name light up on my phone, it was like a quiet reminder of everything we had all lost, but also everything she might still find now that she wasn't stuck cleaning up after someone else's indifference. Ryan, on the other hand, spiraled in his own way by going out more often, drinking too much, and acting like none of it mattered, even though I could tell from the way he kept bringing her up that he still hadn't accepted the fact that she was gone for good this time, and that no last-minute promises or well-timed apologies were going to fix what he had broken through months of neglect. He kept asking me if I thought she'd come back or if she was seeing someone new, and every time I told him the truth that I didn't know, and that maybe instead of worrying about that, he should start asking himself why she left in the first place, and those conversations always ended with him getting defensive or changing the subject because accountability had never been his strong suit. Meanwhile, my connection with Emily became this quiet, growing thing neither of us had words for but both understood on some instinctive level as we continued to talk about everything except the one thing that loomed largest between us. which was the fact that whatever existed now between us hadn't come from chasing it, but from slowly being pulled together by the shared experience of trying to love someone who couldn't love themselves enough to show up. There was a moment one evening when we ran into each other at a bookstore downtown completely unplanned and ended up getting coffee just like old times, and I watched her laugh at something I said and realized I hadn't seen her laugh like that in months, and that's when it hit me how different she looked now, not just on the outside, but in the way she carried herself, like someone who had finally stopped apologizing for wanting to be treated well. We didn't talk about Ryan that night or the past or what any of it meant. We just sat together in the fading light and talked about music and road trips and stupid things like our least favorite pizza toppings and the worst movies we had ever paid to see. And it felt so easy and light that for a second I forgot that things used to be complicated and messy and full of second guessing. I don't know when it shifted exactly, but somewhere in all of that silence and conversation I started to feel something that felt a lot like hope, and it scared me more than I expected because hope always comes with the risk of disappointment, and I wasn't sure I could survive another version of watching someone walk away. Not again. Not this time. After that night, I tried to give myself space to think clearly and not rush into feelings that might have been shaped more by timing than truth, because the last thing I ever wanted was to confuse companionship for connection or let comfort masquerade as love just because it was available in the wake of something that had fallen apart. But even with all that caution, the more I spoke to Emily and the more time we spent together, the harder it became to deny the fact that what was growing between us wasn't temporary and didn't feel accidental and wasn't born from loneliness or convenience, but from something real that had been quietly building for a long time before either of us were brave enough to name it. I started waking up thinking about her and falling asleep hoping she'd text goodnight, and every small part of my day began to feel like it carried a version of her voice in the background. Whether it was a song she once told me she loved playing through my car speakers, or the memory of her face lighting up when she talked about future plans that finally felt like hers instead of an extension of someone else's dreams. It would have been easy to pretend it wasn't happening or to suppress it out of guilt and responsibility, but I also knew that denying your feelings out of fear doesn't make them go away, it just buries them deeper until they resurface at the worst possible time and hurt even more than they would have if you'd just been honest from the beginning. So I told her one afternoon when we were sitting in the park watching the leaves fall like they were rehearsing for winter, and everything around us felt too still for small talk, that I'd started to feel something more than just friendship, and that I didn't know what to do with that feeling, because I wasn't trying to make things complicated or disrespect the history we shared with someone we both used to care about. She didn't speak right away, and I could see in her face that she'd been wrestling with the same storm. Her expression a mixture of relief and fear, and the kind of quiet understanding that only shows up when two people realize they're standing on the edge of something that could either heal them or hurt them, depending on how they choose to move forward. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft and steady, and she said she'd been feeling the same way for a while, but didn't want to put that burden on me, and wasn't sure if I'd ever see her that way because of everything with Ryan, and the fact that lines like this are never easy to redraw once they've been crossed. I told her the truth, that I had no interest in pretending anymore, and that I wasn't looking for something casual or temporary or hidden in shadows. I wanted something real and honest and built on trust from day one, even if it meant walking away from the comfort of ambiguity and facing whatever fallout might come from choosing something that most people wouldn't understand. We sat there for a long time, saying nothing after that, just breathing in the cool air and letting the world move around us, until she reached out and took my hand like she'd been waiting her whole life to feel that kind of certainty. And I knew in that moment that even if everything got messy or people judged or Ryan found out and exploded with rage, I wouldn't regret a single second of what we were building, because it wasn't born from betrayal, it was born from truth finally being allowed to speak. The days that followed were filled with an energy I hadn't felt in years, not the kind that keeps you up at night worrying if you're good enough or wondering if the person beside you is drifting away, but the kind that makes you look forward to small things like texts in the morning and walking to the same places you've walked 100 times, but now they feel brand new just because someone else is finally seeing them with you. Emily and I didn't rush anything or start labeling what we were building right away, because we both understood the weight of everything that had brought us to this place, and we didn't want to turn something gentle into something reckless just because we were afraid of what people might say or how Ryan might react once the truth inevitably found its way to him. Still, we didn't hide. Either we went to familiar places, held hands without looking over our shoulders, and shared the kind of laughter that feels deeper because it's built on real understanding, not just surface-level compatibility that fades the second life stops being easy. I kept waiting for the guilt to hit me like a truck or for that old voice in my head to start telling me I was a terrible brother or a selfish person, but instead what I felt was peace in knowing that for the first time in a long time I wasn't sacrificing myself just to keep someone else from falling apart. And then the inevitable happened because secrets, no matter how well guarded, always have a way of slipping through the cracks, especially in a town where people still talk and timelines still matter to the people who feel entitled to the past even after they've destroyed it. Ryan found out through a friend who saw us together at a coffee shop, and instead of coming to me like a man who wanted answers or even closure, he exploded on social media with half-truths and vague posts that everyone knew were about us. And suddenly people who hadn't spoken to me in months were blowing up my phone asking what was going on, like they had front-row seats to a reality show I never agreed to star in. The worst part wasn't the drama or the messages or even the way he twisted the story to make it seem like we had betrayed him intentionally from the start. It was the way our parents called me and asked how I could do something so hurtful to my own brother without even trying to hear my side or understand the months of emotional labor that had led me to finally choose myself for once. I wanted to scream, to send them screenshots and voice memos and every late-night text Emily had sent me when she was breaking down because Ryan was out again or refusing to talk to her for days. But instead, I just said I was sorry they felt that way and hung up, because defending your peace doesn't always mean proving your innocence. It sometimes just means walking away without slamming the door. Emily was devastated but calm in the way people are when they've already lived through the worst kind of emotional weather, and now all that's left is cleanup and the slow rebuilding that comes afterward when you realize the people who love you will either come around or they won't, and there's nothing you can do to control how they process your truth. In the weeks that followed the fallout, I found myself learning what it truly meant to stand inside your truth even when it wasn't comfortable or universally accepted, because choosing happiness over guilt isn't something that comes naturally when you've spent most of your life trying to earn approval from people who only give it when it fits their expectations. Emily and I stopped checking our phones for reactions and started focusing on what we could actually control, like building routines that made our days feel steady and honest, and reminding each other often that love doesn't have to come with a disclaimer or a defense when it's built from mutual respect and real connection. We talked more during that time than we ever had before, not about the past or what hurt, but about what we wanted next, not just from each other, but from ourselves, because healing isn't just about finding someone who makes you feel good again. It's about finding the version of yourself you lost while trying to be everything for people who never learned how to be anything for you. Ryan didn't reach out again, and eventually the noise from friends and family faded, as it always does when people move on to the next bit of drama, and once the dust settled, all that was left was the two of us and the life we were slowly choosing together in small and intentional ways that felt more meaningful than any big public gestures ever could. We celebrated little things like finishing a week without stress or cooking a new recipe without burning anything, or waking up and realizing that we hadn't talked about anyone else but ourselves in days, which felt like a victory in a world that constantly tries to drag you back into the chaos you worked so hard to escape. I started seeing a therapist during that time, not because anything was falling apart, but because I realized I didn't want to wait until it did to start taking care of myself in a way that was preventative instead of reactive, and those weekly sessions helped me untangle years of responsibility I had placed on my shoulders without questioning whether I was ever meant to carry that kind of weight in the first place. Emily was supportive in the quiet ways that matter most, like reminding me to go when I didn't feel like talking and asking me how it went without pressing for details, and offering to go on walks afterward just to clear the mental dust that always settles after you unpack the parts of yourself you've kept boxed up for too long. We began to feel like a team in the truest sense, not just in love, but in partnership in the day-to-day choosing of each other without needing crisis or tension to remind us of what we had, because what we had wasn't born from drama, it was born from a shared decision to build something better out of the pieces life had handed us. There was a morning not long after when I woke up to the smell of coffee and the sound of Emily humming to herself in the kitchen, and something about the simplicity of that moment hit me harder than any grand gesture ever could, because it reminded me that love is rarely loud or demanding. When it's real, it's quiet and constant, and shows up in ways that don't need to be announced to be understood. I walked in, and she turned around with a half smile and handed me a mug before I could say a word, and for a second, I just stood there thinking about all the versions of myself who would have never believed that peace could look like this, or that I could feel safe enough to let my guard down without bracing for the impact of disappointment. We had stopped talking about the past almost entirely by that point, not because we were pretending it never happened, but because we had given it enough time and space, and we no longer needed to dissect what we already understood too well. Every now and then a memory would surface in conversation, and we'd acknowledge it gently like an old scar that didn't hurt anymore but still had a story, and then we'd move on without getting stuck in it because we knew that healing doesn't mean forgetting, it means remembering without pain. I had dinner with my parents again for the first time in months, and while they didn't bring up Ryan or what happened between us, there was a noticeable shift in the way they spoke to me, less guarded, more curious. Like they were slowly starting to realize that maybe they hadn't seen the full picture, and maybe I wasn't the villain the way Ryan had painted me when everything went sideways. I didn't push them to apologize or explain because some closure doesn't come in words, it comes in presence. In choosing to show up again without dragging yesterday's narrative into the room, and I accepted that for what it was, because peace is about meeting people where they are, not where you wish they'd be. Ryan remained a ghost in the background of it all, someone I no longer felt responsible for rescuing or understanding, and while that distance carried its own kind of grief, it also carried relief, because the truth is not all family bonds are meant to last forever, and some break not with explosions but with quiet, repeated disappointments that eventually stop surprising you. Emily and I had built something so different from what either of us had known before that sometimes it felt surreal. Like we were learning a new language that didn't involve raised voices or cold shoulders or passive-aggressive silence, but instead involved questions like, how can I support you today? Or what do you need from me right now that I'm not seeing? That kind of love changes you in ways you don't notice at first, until one day you catch yourself handling a moment of tension with grace instead of panic, and realize that the version of you who once begged for clarity now demands nothing less than truth and doesn't flinch when it shows up. It's strange how healing creeps in quietly when you're no longer chasing it like a finish line, but simply living in a way that makes room for it to grow naturally without being forced or monitored like some kind of performance meant to prove how far you've come. Emily and I never made any grand declarations or promises about forever, because we both knew that love doesn't guarantee immunity from pain. It only gives you a teammate to face it with when it inevitably arrives. And that truth grounded us more than any fantasy of perfection ever could. We moved into a small house with squeaky floors and too much morning light. A place that never needed to be flawless, because we weren't looking for the kind of life that needed editing. We were building something real from scratch, with mismatched mugs and grocery store flowers and spontaneous slow dances in the kitchen when our favorite songs came on. People still asked questions from time to time, old friends curious about how things unfolded or whether Ryan and I had made peace. And while I never shared all the details, I always told them the same thing. Some people leave your life quietly and some force their exit with fire, but either way, you learn who you are in the aftermath. I didn't regret the choices that led me here, because regret only grows in the shadow of unhealed wounds, and mine had long since become lessons. Reminders of how far I was willing to go for the wrong people, and how far I would now go to protect my peace with the right one. The man I am today no longer apologizes for choosing joy over duty, or for walking away from people who confuse love with obligation. And while it took years of unlearning and 1,000 moments of doubt, I finally trust myself to know when something is real and to hold onto it with both hands. Emily never saved me, and I never saved her, but together we built a space where saving each other was never necessary, because we were already whole when we arrived, we just didn't know it yet. And if you've ever found yourself in the middle of someone else's mess, wondering whether it's your responsibility to fix what they keep breaking, let this be your reminder that love should never feel like a rescue mission. And peace isn't something you have to earn by suffering first, it's something you're already worthy of, simply by being who you are.